It was 11:47 at night. I know the exact time because I had been staring at the clock on my laptop screen, telling myself, just 5 more minutes, William. Just 5 more minutes, and you can go home. The office was almost completely empty, the kind of empty where you can hear the ventilation humming in the ceiling, and your own breathing feels too loud. The city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows were the only warmth in the room. I was an associate at Mercer and Hale, one of the most ruthless, high-stakes law firms in the city. The kind of place where careers were built overnight and destroyed just as fast. And Elizabeth Mercer was the reason for both, senior partner, 34 years old. The kind of woman who walked into a room and made every conversation stop. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because she never was. She didn't need to. Everyone called her the Ice Queen behind closed doors. I never did. Not because I was afraid of her, but because I had always sensed something underneath that stillness. Something carefully held together. That night, she appeared at the edge of my desk like a shadow. No warning, no sound of footsteps. She simply stood there, hugging a case file to her chest, and said in that quiet, controlled voice of hers, "William, my hands are freezing." I looked up, and before I could respond, before I could even process what was happening, she reached across the desk and wrapped both of her cold hands around mine. The room went completely silent, and I forgot every single thing I was supposed to do next. She held my hands for exactly 4 seconds. I counted. Not because I wanted to, but because my brain needed something logical to hold on to while everything else inside me stopped making sense. Then she pulled back, straightened her blazer, looked down at the case file in her arms as though nothing had happened. As though she hadn't just crossed a line that neither of us had ever acknowledged existed. "The Harrington brief needs to be finalized before 7 a.m., she said. Her voice was back to its usual temperature. Composed. Precise. Don't stay too late. And then she walked away. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my own hands. They were still warm from hers. The next morning, I convinced myself it meant nothing. People get cold. Offices have aggressive air conditioning. Elizabeth Mercer was a senior partner with 15 years of calculated professionalism. She wasn't the kind of woman who did things without reason, but she also wasn't the kind of woman who owed me an explanation for anything. I told myself to let it go. But then she walked past my desk at 9:15 and slowed down, just slightly, and said without looking at me, "Good brief, William." 2 words. That was all. But from Elizabeth Mercer, 2 words felt like a standing ovation. Over the following 2 weeks, I started noticing things I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. The way she would linger near the coffee station when I was there, not saying anything, just existing in the same space a little longer than necessary. The way her eyes would find mine first during team meetings, as though she was checking my reaction before forming her own opinion. The way she would slide case files onto my desk personally, instead of sending them through the internal system, even though she had 3 assistants who could have done it. Small things. Quiet things. The kind of things that only mean something if you're already paying attention. And I was paying attention. More than I should have been. One evening, I was alone in the conference room, surrounded by depositions and cold coffee, when she appeared in the doorway. She stood there for a moment, studying the wall of documents I had pinned up, before stepping inside and closing the glass door behind her. "You organize evidence like you're telling a story," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Isn't that what we do?" I replied. "Tell stories, just with evidence instead of imagination." She was quiet for a moment, then something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to make my chest tighten. "Most associates don't think of it that way," she said softly. "Most associates are afraid of you." I replied before I could stop myself. The room held its breath. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and said very quietly, "And you're not." I held her gaze and answered honestly, "No, I'm just curious about you." Something moved behind her eyes, something I couldn't name yet. She looked away first, back at the wall of documents, and straightened a single paper that didn't need straightening. "Finish the Morrison file," she said. "I need it by Thursday." She walked out, but at the doorway, she paused, her back still to me, and said one last thing so quietly I almost missed it. "Curious is dangerous, William." She didn't look back, And I sat alone in that conference room, staring at the space where she had just been, understanding for the first time that I was already in trouble. The question was, so was she. There is a specific kind of torture that comes with wanting something you are not supposed to want. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly, in the pauses between sentences, in the half second too long that your eyes stay where they shouldn't, in the way a simple professional exchange starts feeling like something entirely else. That was my life for the next 3 weeks. It started with the Caldwell case. Elizabeth assigned it to me personally. A brutal corporate litigation that had already burned through 2 senior associates before I touched it. When she handed me the file, she looked at me with that calm, unreadable expression and said, "Try not to panic." "I never panic," I replied, flipping the file open. "I just catastrophize quietly." She blinked, and then, for the first time, I heard it. A short, soft exhale through her nose. Almost a laugh. Not quite, but close enough that I felt it like sunlight breaking through a window that had been shut for years. "At least you're self-aware," she said, and walked away. I stared at the file without reading a single word for a full minute. After that, the Caldwell preparation pulled us into late nights again. And somewhere between the depositions and the counterarguments and the endless rounds of black coffee, something between us began to loosen. She started challenging me differently. Not the way a senior partner tests an associate, but the way someone does when they genuinely want to know what you are made of. "If you were opposing counsel," she said one night, leaning back in her chair and studying the ceiling, "how would you dismantle our argument? Honestly?" "No, William. Lie to me." She glanced over, one eyebrow raised. "Of course, honestly." I laughed. Actually laughed. And she watched me do it with an expression I was beginning to recognize. Quiet. Careful. Like she was storing it somewhere private. "I'd go after the timeline," I said, composing myself. "There's a 48-hour gap in the documentation that we haven't fully explained. Opposing counsel will find it." She was silent for a moment. "I know," she said quietly. "I was waiting to see if you would." I looked at her. And now I know I gave this case to the right person." The words were professional, but the way she said them wasn't. By the second week of Caldwell prep, we had developed something resembling a rhythm. I would push back on her strategies. Carefully, respectfully, and instead of shutting me down the way she did with everyone else, she would pause, consider, sometimes change her position entirely, without ever admitting I had influenced her. I called her out on it once. "You know you just used my argument," I said, keeping my voice neutral. She didn't look up from her notes. "I don't know what you're referring to." The timeline reframing. That was mine from Tuesday. Ideas belong to whoever articulates them best. A pause. "I articulated it better. That is genuinely impressive," I said. "The confidence, not the argument." She looked up then, and this time she actually smiled. Small, brief, like a door opened and then quickly closed. But I saw it, and she knew I saw it. "Don't push your luck, William," she said softly. "I think my luck is doing just fine," I replied. The smile didn't come back, but it didn't need to, because that night, when we finally packed up to leave, she pulled on her coat in the elevator and said, almost to herself, "You make this place feel less exhausting." The doors opened. She walked out. And I stood there, in that empty elevator, staring at the space she had just left, feeling something settle in my chest that I absolutely could not afford to feel. Because the next morning, I found the firm's employee conduct policy sitting on my desk. No note, no name, just the policy. Open to section 7.4, relationships between supervisors and subordinates. Someone was watching us. I stared at that open policy document for a long time. Long enough for my coffee to go cold. Long enough for the morning rush of associates filing past my desk to blur into background noise. Long enough to understand that whoever had placed it there wanted me to feel exactly what I was feeling. Watched, warned, and afraid. I closed the document, slid it into my drawer, and said nothing. But something had shifted in the air of the office that day. A quiet tension that had no name yet. That evening, Elizabeth called me into her office. Not through her assistant. Not through the internal messaging system. She appeared at my desk herself. Something she rarely did in front of others, and said simply, "My office." 5 o'clock. When I walked in, she was standing at the window, her back to me, the city sprawling gold and gray behind the glass. She had her arms crossed. Not the way she did in boardrooms, sharp and commanding, but the way someone does when they are holding themselves together quietly. "Close the door," she said. I did. The silence that followed was different from our usual silences. Those were comfortable. Charged, maybe, but comfortable. This one had weight in it. "Someone filed an internal observation report," she said finally, still facing the window. "About us. About the amount of time we spend working together after hours." I kept my voice steady. "It's case-related. Everything is documented." "I know that." She turned then, and I saw something on her face I had never seen before. Not anger. Not the cool composure she wore like armor. Something quieter. Something tired. "That's not what concerns me." She moved to her desk, sat down, and for a long moment she just looked at her own hands. "7 years ago," she began, "I was an associate here. Not a partner, not the person whose name is on the door." She paused. "There was a senior partner, brilliant man. Everyone respected him." I sat down slowly across from her, saying nothing. "I trusted him," she continued. "Professionally, personally, I thought." She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. "It doesn't matter what I thought. What matters is that when the relationship became complicated, he protected himself. He used his position, his connections, and Section 7.4 to have me quietly reassigned, almost pushed out of the firm entirely. The room was absolutely still. I rebuilt everything," she said, "alone. Every case, every client, every piece of credibility. I rebuilt from nothing. And I promised myself I would never again allow proximity to someone to become a liability." She looked up at me then, and I understood, completely, and finally, why her hands had been freezing that night. It wasn't the temperature of the office. It was the temperature of someone who had been cold. For so long they had forgotten what warmth felt like. And for one unguarded moment, one exhausted, vulnerable moment, she had reached for it without thinking, and then spent 2 weeks quietly terrified by what that meant. "Elizabeth," I said carefully, "what happened to you? That wasn't proximity. That was betrayal." She was quiet. "Those are not the same thing," I said. "And you know that." Something moved across her face. A fracture. Small, almost invisible. The kind that happens when someone hears the exact truth they have been avoiding for years. She looked away. Back to the window. "You should be careful, William," she said softly. "This firm has a long memory." "So do I replied. She didn't respond. But when I stood to leave, I noticed something I will never forget. Her hands, resting on the desk in front of her, were trembling. Just slightly. The way hands do when someone is working very hard not to feel something they are already feeling. I walked out quietly, and I made a decision in that hallway that I knew was going to cost me something. I just didn't know yet how much. 3 days later, I was called into the managing partner's office, Richard Hale, 61 years old, the kind of man who had built his entire identity around the firm's reputation and guarded it the way some people guard their faith, absolutely and without mercy. He had a photograph of the original Mercer and Hale partnership agreement framed behind his glass desk, and he referenced it in conversations the way others reference scripture. His assistant closed the door behind me without making eye contact. That was the first sign. "Sit down, William," Richard said. He didn't look up from the document in front of him immediately. A deliberate pause. The kind designed to make you aware of the power in the room before the conversation even begins. When he finally looked up, his expression was professionally pleasant, which was somehow worse than anger. "You've been doing exceptional work," he said. "The Caldwell case preparation has been noted at the partnership level. You have a real future here." "Thank you," I said carefully. "Which is exactly why," he continued, folding his hands on the desk, "I want to have this conversation with you directly, as someone who wants to see you succeed." He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk toward me. It was a formal written advisory, my name at the top, Elizabeth's name directly below it. "This is not a disciplinary action," he said. "Consider it guidance. The firm has a responsibility to maintain clear professional boundaries between supervisors and their direct reports. It protects everyone, including you." I looked at the document without touching it. "Has Ms. Mercer received one of these?" I asked, a brief pause. "That is not your concern," which told me everything. I left Richard Hale's office and walked directly to the men's restroom at the end of the corridor, stood at the sink. ran cold water over my hands, and stared at my own reflection for a long moment. The firm had made its position clear. What happened next was entirely up to us, but Elizabeth had already made her decision. I realized it the following morning when I arrived at my desk and found that the Caldwell case had been quietly reassigned. My access to the shared case files had been removed overnight, and when I passed her in the corridor at 9 a.m., she looked at me the way she looked at every other associate in the building, professionally, distantly, completely, like those late nights had never happened, like the conference room and the elevator and the trembling hands had all been part of someone else's story. It hit me somewhere between my chest and my stomach, a dull, hollow feeling that I hadn't been prepared for. She was protecting me, I knew that. Intellectually, I understood exactly what she was doing and why. She had been through this before. She knew how the firm operated, how Richard Hale moved quietly and precisely, how careers could be redirected so subtly that you barely felt it happening until you were already somewhere else entirely. She was removing herself before the firm could use her against me. But understanding something and surviving it are two very different things. That evening I sat alone at my desk, long after everyone had gone home. The city lights outside the window blurred slightly at the edges. I didn't touch the work in front of me. I kept thinking about what she had said in her office. I promised myself I would never again allow proximity to someone to become a liability. And then I thought about something she hadn't said, but that I had seen clearly in the trembling of her hands, that she already had, that I already was. My phone buzzed on the desk. A message. No name. Just a number I didn't recognize. I opened it. 3 words. I'm sorry, William. I stared at the screen for a long time, then I typed back 2 words. Don't be. I put the phone down, stared at the ceiling, and understood with complete clarity that I was not willing to let this become the ending. The question was she? I waited until 7 p.m. on a Thursday, late enough that the office had emptied, early enough that the security rotation hadn't changed yet. I had learned the rhythms of this building the way you learn the rhythms of a place you have spent too much of yourself inside. I knocked on her office door, once. Then opened it. Elizabeth was still at her desk. She always was. A case file open in front of her, a pen in her hand, her reading glasses sitting low on her nose, the ones she never wore in meetings, the ones I had only ever seen in these quiet after-hours moments that apparently no longer existed between us. She looked up, and for one fraction of a second, before the professional mask came down, I saw it. Relief, the kind that appears and disappears so fast you could convince yourself you imagined it. She didn't ask what I was doing there. William, I'm not here as your associate, I said quietly. I'm here as someone who is not willing to pretend the last 2 months didn't happen. She set the pen down, took off her glasses, and looked at me with an expression that was so carefully constructed it almost broke my heart, because I knew now exactly how much effort it cost her to maintain it. You read the advisory, she said. I did. Then you understand why this conversation cannot. Elizabeth. She stopped. I had never said her name like that before. Without a qualifier. Without the professional buffer of context or case reference. Just her name. Placed into the silence between us like something I was choosing to set down carefully. She looked at her desk. You are brilliant, she said quietly. You have a career ahead of you that most people in this building would sacrifice a great deal for. I will not be the reason that gets complicated. And if I'm willing to accept that complication, you don't know what you're accepting. Then tell me, I said, not what the policy says, not what Richard Hale implied in his carefully worded advisory. Tell me what you actually want. The room held its breath. She stood up slowly, walked to the window. The same window she had stood at the night she told me about 7 years ago. The same posture, arms crossed, the city golden gray behind her. I want, she started. Stopped, tried again. I have spent 7 years building something that cannot be touched, and every time I think about. Another pause. Longer this time. You make me want things I stopped allowing myself to want, William, and that terrifies me more than any managing partner ever could. I crossed the room, I didn't touch her. I stood beside her at the window, close enough that I could see her reflection in the glass, and I spoke to her reflection because somehow that felt easier for both of us. The night your hands were freezing, I said softly. You didn't reach for the desk. You didn't reach for the case file. You reached for me, and I don't think that was an accident." Her reflection looked at mine. "It wasn't," she whispered. "Then stop punishing yourself for it." Her jaw tightened. Her eyes grew bright in a way that she immediately tried to control, blinking once, deliberately, the way someone does when they are refusing to let themselves cry in front of another person. "If we do this," she said carefully, "it changes everything, our positions, our futures here. Everything." "I know," I said. "And you're not afraid?" I looked at her reflection for a long moment. "I'm terrified," I admitted honestly. "But I'm more afraid of walking out of this office tonight and spending the rest of my career pretending I don't know the difference between who you are in a boardroom and who you are at 11:47 at night." Something broke open in her expression then, not dramatically, not with tears or declarations, just quietly, the way ice doesn't shatter but melts, slowly, irreversibly. She turned from the window, and she reached for my hands, both of them, the way she had that very first night, except this time her hands weren't cold. And this time, neither of us pretended it meant nothing. We didn't make any dramatic declarations that night. There were no grand gestures, no reckless decisions made in the heat of emotion. We simply stood at that window for a long time, her hands in mine, and talked. Really talked. The way we had been circling around for 2 months without ever quite arriving. She told me about rebuilding herself after 7 years ago. The cases she had taken on alone, the partnerships she had quietly earned, the reputation she had constructed brick by brick with nothing but work ethic and sheer refusal to disappear. And I listened. Not as her associate, not as someone waiting for a pause to offer a solution, but as someone who simply wanted to understand the full architecture of the person standing in front of me. At some point, she laughed softly about something I said. A real laugh this time. Not the almost law from the Caldwell preparation, not the careful exhale she allowed herself in professional spaces. A genuine, unguarded laugh that she immediately tried to contain, pressing her lips together, glancing sideways at me. "Don't do that," I said quietly. "Do what?" "Put it back." "The laugh. Don't put it back." She looked at me for a moment, then let it settle naturally on her face, instead of chasing it away. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in that office. The following week, we did something neither of us had expected to do. We walked into Richard Hale's office together. Voluntarily. With a formal written disclosure, prepared correctly, filed through the appropriate HR channels, transparent and documented in every way the firm's policy required. It was not a rebellion. It was not a declaration of war against Section 7.4. It was simply two people choosing honesty over fear and handling it with the same precision and professionalism that had defined both of our careers. Richard Hale read the document in silence, looked up at us once, then back down. Ms. Mercer," he said carefully, "you understand this will require a structural reassignment of supervisory responsibilities." "Already drafted," she said, sliding a second document across his desk. "William will report to the senior partner division directly. All case assignments restructured accordingly." He studied her for a long moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. The acknowledgement of someone who had done something difficult the right way. "I'll have legal review this by end of week," he said quietly. We walked out of that office side by side. And in the corridor, when we were far enough from any open doors, she exhaled slowly beside me, long and deep, like someone setting down something extraordinarily heavy they had been carrying for a very long time. "That," she said quietly, "was terrifying." "You were magnificent," I replied. She glanced at me sideways. "Don't be charming right now, William. I'm being honest. Those are occasionally the same thing," she said, and walked ahead of me down the corridor, but she was smiling. Facing forward, thinking I couldn't see it. I could see it. 6 months later. It is a Saturday morning in early spring. We are in her apartment, which has more sunlight in it than I expected, and more books than any one person should reasonably own. She is sitting across from me at the kitchen table, with a case file open beside her coffee cup, reading glasses on, completely absorbed in something that has nothing to do with me. I watch her for a moment. The way the morning light falls across her face, the way she reaches for her coffee without looking up, the way she is completely, utterly, quietly herself, without armor, without performance, without the careful construction of the woman the firm sees. She looks up suddenly, catches me watching. What? She says. Nothing, I say. Just curious about you. She holds my gaze for a moment, and I watch something move through her eyes. Recognition, warmth, the echo of a conference room, and a late night, and a wall of documents, and a door closing softly. She reaches across the table, and wraps both hands around mine. This time, they are warm. And this time, I know exactly what it means. Some people build walls to survive. And some people are worth every careful, patient brick it takes to sit beside them while they learn. Slowly, and for the first time in a long time, that warmth was never something they needed to be afraid of. It was simply something they deserved.